Singapore's March manufacturing output increased 10.1% on year, beating expectations and prompting some economists to lift first quarter GDP forecasts. While electronics has propped up overall production, higher energy costs and oil prices are filtering through to growth, leaving a more uneven picture for the manufacturing sector. Beatrice Yap reports.
Food manufacturing output snapped 2 months of decline to expand 2.8% in March. But for local firm Taihua, there's little cheer. Ripple effects from the Middle East conflict are squeezing its bottom line as cost prices for bottles and caps jump 40%.
This is very different compared to COVID-19. COVID-19, for the manufacturer, we stop from export, we still can supply local. But this really was, I think, slightly different, because all the raw material will increase, including my packing material.
Add to that, business uncertainties with some cargo still sitting at sea.
We export to mainly around 30 to 40 countries worldwide. Currently, I think the biggest impact is our goods to Middle East. Freight cost has almost doubled because of the closure of Strait of Hormuz.
Disruptions in feedstock supply have already caused chemicals output to decline, with growth slumping to its weakest since 2014. And analysts warn that this may not stay contained.
The truth is, for example, if you have a lack of petrochemical feedstock, it affects many other sectors. For example, construction materials, right? Or even electronics production, some of the required sort of materials, right, will be affected.
Still, there's a bright spot in electronics, which makes up more than a third of manufacturing output. The sector grew 30% in March, its strongest performance in 16 months.
What we see is that globally, demand for semiconductors and other electronics components is accelerating amid a rising prevalence of autonomous AI agents, which as opposed to chatbots. The rising prevalence of autonomous AI agents fuels a higher appetite for computing capacity.
He adds that electronics growth will continue to offset weaknesses in other segments and hold up industrial production for the rest of the year.
And for more analysis, I'm joined by Jeff Ng. He's the head of Asia Macro Strategy at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with that 10.1% jump in manufacturing output. That's quite a big upside surprise. But given the ongoing Middle East disruptions, do you think we're celebrating strength that is already outdated? Because some might say that the data hasn't yet caught the real economic hit yet. Do you agree?
It's a positive development for March because it's better than expected. At the same time, I think it's pointing to trends for at least the next coming few months because of the fact that AI demand continues to be quite strong. So I think that means that electronics sector, the cluster, will still likely do fairly well. Growth will still be fairly robust. But at the same time, I think as you as the news report has already mentioned, the demand is quite uneven across different clusters. So electronics could be one of the better performing sectors, but others may not be so well performing.
And speaking of electronics, that has surged at 30%. And if you strip that part out, the picture actually looks much weaker. Do you think we are overstating the health of Singapore's manufacturing sector by relying too heavily on one star performer?
Well, when we examine the breakdown of all the different clusters, we notice that most of the sectors are still growing. So, for example, the precision engineering, the transport engineering, the general manufacturing as well. So I think overall it's showing that the demand, at least for the March performance, as well as maybe for the next 1-2 months, is still likely to be fairly positive at this stage. Of course, as we mentioned, the performance is quite uneven, so there are some sectors that continue to lag behind.
Now, let's look a bit at the chemicals sector, right? Speaking of lagging behind. Is this a cyclical downturn in your view, or do you think it's an inherently structural challenge?
I think before the issue with the Middle East, we already saw that the performance for the chemical cluster was not as robust. Last year, it barely grew, and demand was not very strong. At the same time, I think the cluster continues to transform and is likely to transform towards a more value-added product in terms of output. So I think that will likely continue. So in terms of the structural shift, it could still be there. but now it's hit by those headwinds coming from the Middle East. So it may still mean that, unfortunately for this cluster, we may still see some drags in the coming few months.
And meanwhile, we hear that there are some possible upward revisions to first quarter GDP figures. What's your take on this? Do you see any possible upside risks, especially for the rest of this year as well?
I think it's very likely that we will see growth of around 5% year-on-year for the first quarter performance. So that's an upgrade to the advanced estimates of, I think, close to 4%. So it may still mean that growth will still be fairly healthy overall, perhaps close to the 4% mark. But I think it also depends on the fluidity of the situation. If the uncertainty and the Middle East situation drags on, or if the conflict broadens to other parts of the world, then we may increasingly see the downside risk for the Singapore economy materialize, because our economy is still very much dependent on the energy inputs for the various products.
Let's take a closer look at that scenario, right, where the Middle East tensions do worsen, and if energy and shipping costs start to spike even further, which manufacturing clusters do you think would be most exposed?
I think in the near term, of course, the chemical sector will continue to see some downside risk because of the disruptions to the fertilizer output already. And if the conflict prolongs, I think when we are starting to see more energy shortages, not just in Singapore, but also regionally, globally as well, then even the star performance like electronic sector, I think they may still they may start to see some downside risk, owing to the fact that you still need energy to move them around or to produce all these chips, for instance.
Right. Now, for our viewers watching now, and they're thinking, does strong manufacturing growth really translate into better job security and also wage growth? How would you break that down for us?
I think the short answer is not necessarily, but there's some positives to it, because if manufacturing does well, it will translate to, I think, better outlook for the overall economy. Sentiment for the ground will also be quite positive, which also bodes well for investment as well. And I think manufacturing, if it's doing well, some other services sector that's linked to the sector, like transport or financial services, they may also benefit. However, I think if some teams like automation, if there's more sort of like restructuring and reliance on capital rather than labor, then there may be less upsides to the labor market.
Right. Now, Jeff, very quickly before we go, do you see any bright spots, amid all the volatility and the Middle East tensions? What are some bright spots you see going forward in the rest of the year, perhaps?
Yeah. I will imagine that the AI team continues to be fairly strong. I think that there's still a lot of demand that's coming from the various competitors eyeing for market share for the technology space, and the possibilities now are relatively high. They're quite limitless at this stage. We can't possibly imagine every single scenario. So there'll be, I think, continued investment in this sector despite the uncertainty that goes along. And then at the same time, I think, while there's a lot of uncertainty coming in from the Middle East, but I think the world continues to think about ways to get by and to think about ways to get around the situation. So, for instance, instead of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz or the Suez Canal, maybe they will swing past Africa to get the goods to their intended destination. So I think this will be likely the bright spots for the overall economy, even as we are hit by a lot of uncertainties.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us today. I've been chatting with Jeff Ng from Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation.